While Jesus walked the dusty roads of Galilee and debated in the markets of Jerusalem, what did the rest of the world look like? Imagine for a moment stepping out of that small provincial town and spinning the globe 2,000 years back. Cities rose with stone and sweat, ships threaded oceans and seas on seasonal winds, and scholars measured the planet with nothing more than geometry and letters. This is not a story of a single civilization. It is a tour of a world that was varied, surprisingly connected, and often stranger than our expectations. We anchor our trip to the early 1st century CE, the era when Roman authority spread across the Mediterranean, when someone named Jesus walked in Judea and Galilee, and when a mosaic of other powers, peoples, and technologies shaped daily life from the Nile to the Yangtze. That anchor helps us say, while this was happening here, look over there, without pretending these places shared a single narrative. In Judea and Galilee, the Roman administration and local client rulers like Herod shaped politics and public life. Roads and legions were visible signs of Rome's reach. Local marketplaces hummed with familiar spices, news, and arguments. It's a useful starting point. It gives us a human-scale image to contrast with far-flung scenes we're about to visit. If this trip sounds like your kind of curiosity, subscribe for more big-picture history journeys. Stick around, because the world we're about to visit is full of surprises that change the way we see the ancient past. Start with Rome itself. Picture a city of marble temples, crowded neighborhoods, horse-drawn carts, and the constant thrum of markets. Scholars estimate Rome's population at the time to be on the order of hundreds of thousands, perhaps approaching 1 million. Estimates vary, and urban densities and census methods are complex. But the point is this: Rome was one of the largest urban centers on Earth. Under the umbrella of the Pax Romana, an uneasy but real peace enforced by Roman military power, trade moved along roads, across the Mediterranean, and into provincial towns. Public baths, aqueducts carrying water for fountains and latrines, and monumental architecture turned the city into a stage where political power and daily life met. Yet Rome's city life was only part of the picture. Culture in the Mediterranean was cosmopolitan. Philosophies, mystery cults, and a variety of religious practices circulated alongside Greek literature and Roman law. Think of Rome as a dense hub in a web of connections. Ideas, goods, and people flowed through it, but many of those threads extended far beyond the Italian peninsula. Next stop, Alexandria, a city that looked very different from Rome, but matched it in ambition. Founded in the wake of Alexander's conquests and shaped by the Ptolemaic dynasty, Alexandria, in the area of modern-day Egypt, was a settled port with a cosmopolitan population. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, merchants from the Red Sea, and scholars who gathered around institutions devoted to learning. At the heart of this scholarly scene was the museum and the library, institutions that in later memory became symbols of ancient learning. It's worth pausing on a human image. Imagine a scholar in Alexandria comparing weather at different ports, measuring shadows, and using geometry to reason about the shape of the earth. Eratosthenes, a librarian and scientist associated with Alexandria, is widely credited with an early, elegant calculation of Earth's circumference, using measurements of shadows at different latitudes and simple geometry. The achievement is striking because it shows a way of knowing that did not need expensive voyages. The library and its networks made large-scale problems feel manageable. We'll return later to the famous losses of knowledge tied to Alexandria, but for now, let this image stand. A city where books, ships, and scholars converged, and where knowledge about the wider world was actively being formed. A quick note here. Sponsored message, brief and clearly marked. Sponsored message. This episode is brought to you by Allura and Google Gemini. They help creators research, script, and visualize historical stories. If you're curious, check the description for a short link. Back to the tour. Sail down the Red Sea and across the Gulf of Aden, and you meet Aksum, often called Axum in older literature, a kingdom in the highlands and coastal region in the area of modern-day Eritrea and northern Ethiopia. Aksum was rising as an important regional power thanks to its position on maritime trade routes connecting the Roman Mediterranean with Arabia, India, and beyond. Merchants carried incense, ivory, and other valuable goods through its ports. The skyline would have been a mix of stone buildings and stelae, tall carved monuments that marked graves or royal markers, and the economy reflected both highland agriculture and vibrant seafaring commerce. Aksum reminds us that power in this period wasn't limited to the Mediterranean and the great Eastern empires. A kingdom perched between sea lanes could wield outsized influence. Crossing back across the northern deserts and into Mesopotamia, we encounter the Parthian Empire.
Parthia was Rome's large, often uneasy rival to the east. Its political structure was less centralized than Rome's centralized bureaucracy. Scholars describe Parthia as a loose federation of local rulers and satraps that nonetheless held together through military strength and diplomacy. The empire dominated the overland routes connecting the Near East to Central and South Asia. Parthian horse archers and heavy cavalry were renowned. So were the caravan routes that crossed their territory.
The boundaries of Parthia shifted over time, but its significance lies in this. The first-century world included powerful, organized states outside Rome that shaped commerce, war, and culture across Eurasia. A pattern already emerges. In these first 4 stops, Rome, Alexandria, Axum, Parthia, we see cities and kingdoms tied to long-distance trade, where ideas and goods traveled surprisingly far. Trade did not mean equal exchange or uniform culture, but it did create networks that connected distant lives. Now let's push farther east. On the Indian subcontinent, the political landscape in the early century CE was shaped by the legacies of earlier empires. The Mauryan dynasty of the 3rd century BCE had left a deep imprint, including the spread of Buddhism as a trans-regional movement. By the 1st century CE, Buddhist ideas and monasteries continued to circulate across South Asia and beyond. Trade routes, maritime lanes across the Arabian Sea, and coastal hubs along India's western and eastern shores linked South Asia to the Red Sea world and to the Roman Mediterranean. These routes carried spices, fine textiles, and other goods that made their way into Roman markets. Archaeological finds and ancient texts show Roman coins and goods in Indian contexts and vice versa, suggesting active exchange. In the northwest of South Asia, in the region of Gandhara, an area roughly along the modern borderlands of Pakistan and Afghanistan, artistic forms blended Hellenistic and Buddhist elements in what historians call Greco-Buddhist art. Sculptures from that area show the melding of Greek stylistic traits, naturalistic drapery, poses, with Buddhist iconography. This artistic hybridity is a concrete sign of cultural interactions that traveled with traders, monks, and artisans. Head further east to Han China. The Han dynasty presided over a large bureaucratic state in the area of modern-day China. It employed extensive administrative systems, census practices, and state-sponsored scholarship. Roads, canals, and government granaries were part of an apparatus that supported large populations and armies. The Han state also participated in long-distance trade. Silk, in particular, moved westward along a series of overland and maritime routes, often grouped under the phrase Silk Road. While the precise details of any single caravan vary, the broader pattern is clear. Luxury textiles, metals, and ideas flowed between China and the West in multiple stages. It's also important to note the technological trajectory in East Asia. The Han period saw advances in metallurgy, astronomy, and mechanical devices. Later in the early century CE, inventions and refinements, better papermaking techniques, and mechanisms like an early seismography credited to Zhang Heng would become important markers of Chinese ingenuity.
Scholars debate exact dates and attributions, but the overall point is that Han society supported sophisticated technical and scientific projects, and these developments contributed to long-term shifts in information handling and statecraft. Just across the sea from these developments, in the islands that would become Japan, societies were in different phases of transformation. The Yayoi period marks a broad shift toward wet rice agriculture and new kinds of material culture, including greater use of metallurgy in some contexts. But Japan's political organization at the time was more regionally fragmented and less centralized compared with Han China. Instead of a single bureaucratic state, the archipelago hosted local chiefdoms and communities negotiating power at a smaller scale. The contrast is useful. A world that was technologically inventive in many places did not look the same everywhere. Variety mattered. Pause for a moment. In these stops, from the Indian Ocean rim to East Asia, we see trade and culture traveling great distances, but with different speeds and intensities. Silk and spices could move hundreds or even thousands of miles in stages. Artistic styles could travel with artisans and with ideas carried by merchants and monasteries. The first-century world was not a single web, but a collection of interlocking threads. Now turn to the vastness of the Pacific. Oceania and Polynesia present a story of remarkable seafaring skill, but timing is crucial. Skilled navigators had already colonized many islands across the Pacific, using deep knowledge of stars, winds, and currents. Polynesian voyages spread people, plants, and cultural practices across enormous distances.
Yet some islands, Rapa Nui or Easter Island, for example, were colonized later in the first millennium CE. They do not all line up neatly with our early 1st century anchor. The point is this: the Pacific world was dynamic, and its explorers and settlers used techniques of navigation that rival any ancient maritime tradition. But the pace and pattern of colonization varied across regions. Crossing the Pacific in our imagination, we land in the Americas, another set of diverse, developed societies, disconnected from Eurasian networks by the limits of pre-Columbian transoceanic contact. Mesoamerica, in particular, hosted urban life and sophisticated institutions. Teotihuacan, in the basin of central Mexico, was an urban center that would grow into one of the largest cities in the hemisphere. Its broad avenues, monumental pyramids, and planned neighborhoods give a sense of civic scale. Population estimates for Teotihuacan vary widely and depend on archaeological interpretation. Scholars debate whether tens or hundreds of thousands lived there at its peak, and estimates should be treated as provisional. Nearby, the Maya polities of the lowlands produced advanced writing systems, complex calendar calculations, and impressive architecture.
The Maya long count calendar and the mathematical use of zero are striking achievements that reveal high levels of intellectual and technical sophistication. In South America, diverse cultural traditions unfolded along coasts and in river basins. Along the Atlantic coast and in some parts of the Amazon, archaeologists have found evidence of semi-sedentary communities, elaborate ceramic traditions, and large shell middens known as sambaquis, which record long-term human use of coastal resources. Metallurgy in South America developed in different regions and at different times. In many places, fully developed metalworking techniques were less central to daily life than ceramics, textiles, and architecture. The Amazon basin, long thought to be a sparse frontier, is now being reinterpreted through new archaeological finds. Pottery, earthworks, and signs of intentional landscape modification suggest complex human activity that once left fewer traces than stone monuments in drier climates. In other words, absence of large stone architecture does not mean absence of social complexity. Everywhere we go, preservation shapes what we see. Dry climates preserve texts and monuments differently from humid jungles. Stone survives better than wood. Literate societies leave archives that attract historians. That leads to a major point: the unevenness of the historical record. Places that burned libraries, had wet climates, or used perishable materials are underrepresented in the narratives we inherit. The Library of Alexandria stands as a poetic symbol of lost knowledge, but historians caution against a single tidy story of its destruction. The loss of texts was likely a complex process spread across centuries and tied to political upheavals, changing institutional funding, and the fragility of manuscripts themselves. Still, the idea of libraries and of intellectual hubs where people compared reports from sailors and merchants matters for understanding how ancient people made sense of a much larger world. Return briefly to the Mediterranean and imagine the everyday textures of life. A market in Alexandria sells papyrus scrolls, purple-dyed textiles from the Levant, and glassware blown in workshops. A caravan in Mesopotamia straps goods onto camels and sets out for the Silk Road. A Roman merchant in a port like Ostia loads amphorae of olive oil onto a trading vessel bound for Alexandria or Carthage. These are not isolated vignettes. They are linked by overlapping routes and by people who routinely moved, traded, and translated ideas. Let's pull back again and consider technologies and knowledge. In different places, innovations changed how people handled information, moved goods, and organized labor. Road building and standardized coinage in the Roman world, administrative record-keeping in Han China, and the maritime knowledge of Indian Ocean sailors each made large-scale coordination possible in their own ways. Greco-Buddhist artistic synthesis in Gandhara shows how aesthetics traveled and were remixed. The spread of monastic institutions in South Asia shows how ideas and social systems traveled with religious movements. The takeaway is not that everyone was doing exactly the same thing. It's that diverse technologies and organizational forms enabled larger scales of interaction than earlier eras had seen. Now move to a more detailed look at some places we've passed quickly, places that reward a longer gaze. Start with Alexandria and the story of knowledge. The city's collection of scholars and its ambitions made it a magnet for texts and learning. Libraries in the ancient world did not look like modern public libraries. They were often royal or institutional collections, attached to centers of learning, with scholars who worked to copy, comment on, and sometimes translate texts.
Eratosthenes' calculation of the Earth's circumference, for instance, stands out because it used careful observation and a network of reports, measurements of shadows at different latitudes, to estimate the planet's size. It's a reminder that intellectual advances could come from combining observation and reasoning, not just from voyages or raw resources. But Alexandria's later reputation as the place where all knowledge was lost needs nuance. Historians today point to a range of causes for the disappearance of texts: wars and sieges, administrative collapse, neglect, the decay of papyrus in humid conditions, and the gradual dispersal of collections. Different collections might have perished at different moments. The real lesson is a sobering one. Our image of antiquity is shaped as much by what survived as by what disappeared, and every lost scroll narrows the range of voices we can hear 2 millennia later. Return again to trade and networks. Maritime trade across the Indian Ocean was seasonal. Sailors timed voyages to match monsoon winds, moving between ports in the Red Sea, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia. Ships carried spices, textiles, and luxury goods, as well as everyday items. On land, networks of caravan routes linked the Mediterranean to Central Asia and beyond. It wasn't one road, but a chain of exchanges where goods passed between hands many times before reaching distant markets. These exchanges didn't produce homogenized cultures. They produced hybrid forms: religious ideas adapted to local practices, artistic styles recombined with local motifs, and commodities that acquired new meanings in different places. Let's turn south into Africa again, but this time to think about connectivity and internal diversity. The Sahel, the Nile Valley, and the Red Sea littoral hosted a variety of cultures. Axum's access to maritime routes gave it leverage, and with that leverage came cultural exchange.
Later centuries would see the Christianization of Aksum and the construction of massive stone churches. But in the first century, what mattered most was the commercial corridor. Local elites controlled resources like ivory and frankincense and traded them across the Red Sea and into the Mediterranean world. This kind of node-based power, where control of a port or highland route translated into influence, was characteristic of several regions around the Indian Ocean rim. Traveling now to Parthia, it's useful to highlight an image of rivalry. Roman emperors and Parthian kings competed and negotiated over influence in Armenia and Mesopotamia. Borders were porous and negotiated through diplomacy as much as warfare. The Parthians managed to sustain a large empire through a combination of decentralized rule and military prowess, and their position as a transit zone for luxury goods made them crucial players in Eurasian trade. South Asia deserves another close look. The influence of Buddhism and of monastic networks is striking. Monks traveled long routes, founding monasteries that served as points of exchange for religious ideas, texts, and pilgrimage. These movements helped spread literacy and philosophical systems across vast distances. The artistic result, the Greco-Buddhist sculptures of Gandhara, embodies a cross-cultural aesthetic that historians use as a marker of contact and synthesis. Meanwhile, maritime trade sent spices, pearls, and textiles westward and brought silver and Roman goods eastward. The archaeological evidence of Roman coins in Indian contexts demonstrates one small facet of these long-distance links. Shift again to East Asia, where the Han state's administrative complexity shaped everyday life in profound ways. State examinations, officials, and record-keeping supported a large integrated economy. Government-sponsored mapping, census practices, and statecraft allowed rulers to mobilize resources across vast territories. Chinese silk, admired across Eurasia, became a commodity that symbolized both luxury and the technical skill of textile production. While the full-blown technologies we associate with later centuries, refined papermaking methods or mechanical seismographers, are often dated a little later, the Han era set in motion the institutional and technical conditions that made these developments possible. The broader lesson is that large-scale bureaucracy and administrative record-keeping changed how societies could plan, tax, and fight wars. After several regions pause and reflect, across this globe, cities, ports, and empires show patterns of exchange, of goods, ideas, and techniques, but the connections are uneven and often indirect. A silk thread might move in stages from China to Central Asia, carried by multiple hands before it reached the Mediterranean. That chain involved a mix of state actors and private entrepreneurs, merchants and monks, sailors and caravan leaders.
The first-century world was networked enough for long-distance cultural exchange, but fragmented enough that local identities and institutions remained central. Now, some closer looks in the Americas. Teotihuacan's urban plan speaks to elaborate civic organization. Broad avenues lined with apartment compounds, massive pyramids, and neighborhood workshops show a city where craft production and urban administration mattered. Its influence radiated into surrounding regions through trade and possibly through religious and political ties. The Maya lowlands, meanwhile, present a tapestry of city-states, each with its own political calendar and ritual life. Maya calendrical systems and their inscriptions show careful record-keeping, astronomy, and mathematical sophistication. The Maya used positional notation and a symbol for zero, achievements that placed them among the world's mathematically inventive cultures. In the Amazon and along South America's coasts, archaeology has changed some long-standing assumptions. Where earlier explorers saw a virgin wilderness, new research reveals signs of long-term human management. Terra preta soils, raised fields, and intricate ceramic traditions point to intentional landscape modification and sustained settlement in some regions. Samba Keys, large shell mounds, demonstrate how coastal communities accumulated material traces over centuries, creating a layered record of human activity. These are not isolated curiosities. They show that social complexity took many material forms that do not always survive in stone. We've been careful throughout this tour to emphasize uncertainty where appropriate. Population figures are best presented as ranges, informed by archaeological surveys and historical inference. The destruction of libraries is rarely a single dramatic event, and the movement of goods is often a patchwork of middlemen, merchants, and state actors. The historian's job is to assemble these fragments and to remain aware of what we cannot know for sure. As the trip winds towards a close, let's pull together several core themes. First, the first-century world was both connected and fragmented. Long-distance exchange mattered. Silk, spices, precious metals, and ideas traveled between Rome, Alexandria, Axum, Parthia, India, and China. But connectivity happened through networks of intermediaries, seasonal winds, and local institutions. Second, technological and institutional forms differed by region. Rome's roads and law, Han China's bureaucracy, Indian Ocean sailors' navigation skills, and Mesoamerican urban planning were distinct answers to the logistical challenges of large societies. Third, preservation biases shape our picture. Climates, materials, and scholarly focus determine which stories have survived and which remain shadowed. Finally, cultural hybridity was common. Art forms, religious ideas, and material goods fused into new expressions wherever human contact occurred.
Before we end, a short thought experiment that brings this into present-day perspective without forcing an analogy. Imagine reading a travelogue that mentions only the capitals of a vast empire and missing whole continents of vibrant life because the writer didn't travel there. Our surviving sources are a bit like that travelogue, rich in some places, thin in others. That doesn't make one part of the ancient world advanced and another backward. Rather, it reveals different choices, materials, and ecological contexts that shaped survivals differently. As we close, it's worth returning to the human scale. A potter in Teotihuacan, a caravan leader in Parthia, a scholar in Alexandria, a sailor in the Indian Ocean, and a farmer in the Yayoi archipelago, all lived in systems that connected to wider circuits, sometimes directly, sometimes only faintly. Their lives were shaped by local conditions and by distant ties. 2,000 years ago, the planet was not a single unified globe of instant communication, but it was not isolated islands either. It was a stitched-together world of trade, ideas, and people, messy, unequal, inventive. If this trip inspired you, check the description for sources and further reading. I've included a list of accessible books and articles, plus links to deeper dives. We have an extended video on Alexandria's intellectual world and another on Teotihuacan's urban life. Watch either one to go behind the scenes on a specific stop from this tour. And if you enjoyed this journey, subscribe so we can take more of these global, time-bending trips together. 2 final reminders before we part. First, be humble about what has been lost. Ancient silence often hides complexity we can no longer reconstruct. Second, remember the richness of variety in the past. Not a ladder of progress, but a field of different strategies for living at scale. Thank you for traveling back with me 2,000 years. If you've got a region or a city you want explored in more depth, leave a comment. Your suggestion might be the next destination.